London. Abbey Road Studios. November 1997. The hallway outside Studio 2 was empty at 9:30 in the evening. The cleaners had gone home. The session musicians had packed their cases and left an hour ago. The only sound in the entire building was the low hum of the heating system, and faintly, the sound of a piano being played by someone who wasn't performing. Someone who was thinking out loud. Paul McCartney sat alone at the Studio Grand, not recording, not rehearsing, just playing fragments. 4 bars of something, then silence. 3 bars of something else. Then his hands would go still, and he would stare at the keys like they owed him an answer. His assistant, Claire, had been with him for 11 years. She knew when to enter a room and when to stand at the door. Tonight, she stood at the door. It had arrived that afternoon through the regular post, not the managed fan mail system, not the MPL office channel. Somehow, it had come directly. Plain white envelope, no return address. A postmark that made Claire stop when she saw it. She had held it for 4 hours before deciding to bring it in. She said his name once, quietly. He looked up. She crossed the room and set the envelope on the piano lid without a word. Paul looked at the postmark. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. He picked it up, opened it slowly, the way you open something when you're not sure you're ready for what's inside. He read. The room was completely still. Claire watched his face move through something she had no name for. Then Paul McCartney set the letter face down on the piano, stood up, and walked to the window. He stood there for 47 seconds without speaking. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Because the man who had written the soundtrack to half a century of human life was standing at a window in the dark. And whatever was in that letter had just undone something in him that 11 years of working beside him had never touched. She had seen him grieve John Lennon. She had watched him hold himself together while Linda was dying. She had never, not once, seen him look like this. Like a man who had just been handed the one thing he didn't know he'd been searching for. To understand what that letter contained, you have to go back 20 years. Back to Liverpool. Back to a city that was still rebuilding itself from the inside out, and back to a boy who was doing the same thing. Robert Callahan was 19 years old in the autumn of 1977. His father worked the docks. His mother cleaned offices on Matthew Street 3 nights a week. The same street where the Cavern Club still breathed underground. Where the Beatles had played 292 times before the world knew their names. Robert grew up 1 mile from that street. He grew up inside that music the way other people grow up inside religion. Not as a fan, not as a follower, but as a true believer. Someone for whom the songs weren't entertainment. They were evidence. Evidence that Liverpool produced something the world couldn't ignore. Evidence that working-class boys from nowhere could matter. He owned 3 Beatles records. Not because money was tight, though it was, but because he played those 3 until the grooves went white and the sound went thin, and he had to hold the needle down with a coin to keep them tracking. Help, Rubber Soul, Abbey Road. He knew every breath, every imperfection, every moment where you could hear a chair creak or fingers shift on a fret. He knew Paul McCartney's voice, the way you know the voice of someone who has talked you through your worst nights without ever knowing your name. November 1977. A pub in Toxteth. A fight that started over nothing, the way the worst ones always do. Robert didn't throw the first punch. The man who did was gone by the time the police arrived. Robert was the one still standing, and in the eyes of the law, that was enough. 20 years. Manslaughter. The judge read the sentence in a voice that suggested he had already moved on to the next case before he finished the words. Robert Callahan was taken to HM Prison Wormwood Scrubs on a gray December morning. He was 19 years old. He had 3 Beatles records at home that nobody would play while he was gone. He had a mother who would sit at the kitchen table that night and not eat her dinner. And he had, tucked somewhere deep inside a chest that was already learning how to be a wall, the memory of a voice singing through a radio in the house on the corner. Once there was a way to get back homeward, and the feeling, fading now, that those words had once meant something true. He didn't know yet how long he would need them to stay true. For the first 3 years, Robert Callahan didn't write anything. He kept his head down, did what was required, and built a version of himself that could survive the days without fracturing. Prison has its own rhythm: meals, count, work detail, lights out. And if you let that rhythm replace the one you came in with, you stop feeling the gap where your real life used to be. Robert let it replace everything. It was easier that way. Then, in the winter of 1980, a guard named Fletcher brought a transistor radio into the common room and left it on the table without explanation. It sat there for 3 evenings before anyone touched it. On the 4th evening, someone turned it to a BBC station, and the common room filled with music for the first time in as long as Robert could remember. He was playing cards at the far table when it came through the speaker. He didn't hear it immediately. The room was loud, men talking, someone arguing near the door. But then the volume shifted, or the noise around him dropped just enough, and Paul McCartney's voice cut through everything, like a light under a door. Golden slumbers. Robert set his cards face down on the table. The man across from him said something. Robert didn't hear it. He was somewhere else entirely. Not Liverpool, not the flat on the corner, not even the memory of the record player. He was inside the song itself, in the place where the melody opens up, and the voice stops performing and starts meaning it. And the words, "Once there was a way to get back homeward," landed in his chest, like something he had lost and just been handed back. He made a decision in that moment. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind that announces itself. Just a quiet, cellular decision. The kind that happens somewhere below thought. He decided to survive. Not escape, not appeal, not fight the system. Just survive. Stay intact long enough to walk out the other side, as something resembling the person who had walked in. He started writing that night. Not to anyone in particular at first. Letters to his mother, to the judge, to John Lennon, who had been shot dead in New York 3 weeks earlier and could not write back. He filled notebooks. He wrote about the docks and Matthew Street and the way Abbey Road sounded on a Saturday morning through a thin wall. He wrote about what music actually does to a person when there is nothing else in the room. In 1983, he addressed an envelope for the first time. Paul McCartney, MPL Communications, London. He stared at it for a long time. Then he put it in his drawer and didn't send it. He would put 14 more in that drawer over the next 14 years. The 15th one he sent. The letter arrived at MPL Communications on a Thursday morning in October 1997. It almost didn't reach him. The mail coordinator, a careful woman named Judith, who had worked the desk for 9 years, processed 200 pieces of correspondence every week. Fan mail went into the standard system, logged, sorted, answered with a signed photograph and a form letter that was warm enough to feel personal and efficient enough to process in bulk. Anything unusual went into a secondary pile for review. Anything from a prison address would normally have gone into a third pile entirely, one that was quietly filed and never mentioned upward. Judith held Robert's letter for a long time. The envelope was plain. The handwriting was deliberate, not the rushed scrawl of someone dashing off a note, but the careful script of someone who had written the same words many times in their head before committing them to paper. She turned it over. No return address, just the postmark. She made a decision she couldn't fully explain afterward, even to herself. She wrote on a yellow post-it, "This one feels different." She placed it on Paul's desk. Paul read it alone that evening, after everyone had gone. Robert had not written to ask for anything. There was no request inside the envelope, no plea for intervention, No appeal for financial help. No ask of any kind. What Robert had written was quieter and more devastating than any request. He had written to report a fact. The fact was this. On a night in December 1980, 3 weeks after John Lennon was killed, a radio in a prison common room had played Golden Slumbers, and the sound of Paul McCartney's voice coming through that speaker had been the precise moment Robert Callahan decided not to disappear into himself permanently. He wrote it plainly, without decoration. He wrote it the way you report something true when you have waited 20 years to say it, and no longer have any interest in making it sound impressive. He closed the letter with one paragraph that Paul would later describe in a private conversation as the most honest thing anyone had ever said to him about music. I don't expect you to remember me. I don't expect anything at all. I only needed you to know that your music kept a man alive in the specific hours when he had no other reason to stay that way. That's what it did. I thought the person who made it deserved to know. Paul set the letter down, picked up a photograph from his desk drawer. John, Abbey Road rooftop, 1969, laughing at something just off camera. Set the photograph beside the letter. Sat with both of them in the lamplight for a long time. He called Wormwood Scrubs directly. Not through his lawyer, not through management, not through any of the structures that exist specifically so that Paul McCartney never has to make an uncomfortable phone call himself. He called the main number, gave his name, asked to speak to the warden. The duty officer hung up. He called back. The duty officer hung up again. He called a third time, spelled his name slowly, and asked, with the particular quiet of someone who is not accustomed to being doubted, but has decided not to make that anyone's problem tonight, to please be connected to whoever was in charge. There was a silence on the line that lasted 11 seconds. Then, hold, please. 3 weeks later, a black car pulled up outside Wormwood Scrubs on a gray Tuesday morning. No press, no cameras, no management, no publicist. Paul McCartney stepped out wearing a plain jacket and carrying a canvas bag, looking like a man who had come to fix something, not to be seen fixing it. He walked through the gates alone, and somewhere inside, a man who had survived 20 years on the sound of a voice through a prison wall was about to sit across a small table from the person that voice belonged to, with no idea that he was coming. The meeting room inside Wormwood Scrubs was the size of a large cupboard. One table, bolted to the floor, 2 plastic chairs, a fluorescent strip light that buzzed at a frequency designed, it seemed, to make every thought feel slightly more desperate than it actually was. A guard stood at the door with his hands behind his back and his eyes on the middle distance. Paul was already seated when Robert was brought in. Nobody had told Robert who had requested the visit. That was deliberate. Paul had asked specifically that Robert not be told. Not out of cruelty, but because he wanted to see the man before the man had time to become someone performing a reaction. He wanted to see the person who had written that letter. Robert Callahan stepped through the door, saw the man sitting at the table, and stopped walking entirely. The guard behind him put a hand on his arm to keep him upright. Paul stood. He didn't extend his hand immediately. He just stood, the way you stand when you want someone to understand that you came here as a person, not a celebrity. That the distance between them, in this room, was exactly 0. He said, "Sit down, Robert, please." Robert sat. He could not speak. His hands were flat on the table in front of him, pressed down, as though the table were the only fixed point in a room that had started moving. Paul reached into the canvas bag. He placed Robert's letter on the table between them, the original, still folded along the same creases. Robert looked at it the way you look at something you wrote in private and never expected to survive the journey. Paul said, "You wrote about a night in December 1980. Golden slumbers. A radio through the wall." He paused. The fluorescent light hummed. John died 3 weeks before that night. Robert said nothing. There was nothing to say. Paul continued, his voice level and quiet. The voice of someone who had decided, before entering the building, exactly how honest he was going to be. I couldn't play that song for 6 years after he was gone. Couldn't finish it on stage. Left the room if it came on the radio. I thought it was broken. I thought I'd broken it just by continuing to exist after he didn't. He looked directly at Robert. You're the first person who has ever told me what it sounded like from the other side. What it actually did. In the real world. In the dark. Robert's shoulders moved once. Paul reached back into the canvas bag and set a cassette tape on the table. The label was handwritten in blue ink. Paul's own hand pressed hard into the paper. It read, Songs for the Long Nights. 14 tracks. Never released. Never played for anyone. I don't know how many days you have left in here, Paul said. But when you walk out, if you want, there's a session booked at Abbey Road, and there's a chair with your name on it. The guard at the door looked at his shoes. The fluorescent light hummed. Robert Callahan put his face in his hands, not from grief, not from gratitude, but from the overwhelming structural relief of being seen by exactly the right person at exactly the right moment. The kind of relief that doesn't make a sound because it is too large for sound. Paul sat with him in the silence and did not look away. Robert Callahan walked out of Wormwood Scrubs on a Tuesday morning in March 1998. The sky was the particular gray of early English spring. Not quite winter anymore. Not yet anything warmer. There was no family waiting. His mother had passed in 1991, sitting in the same kitchen chair where she had not eaten her dinner the night they took him away. His father had gone years before that. One person was standing by a car at the curb. Not Paul. Paul had sent his longtime studio engineer, a quiet man named David, who handed Robert an envelope without ceremony and unlocked the passenger door. Inside the envelope was a single index card. Paul's handwriting pressed hard into the paper the same way it had been pressed into the cassette label. It read, You kept your word for 20 years. Now come keep mine. Abbey Road, April 3rd, 10 o'clock. Robert arrived on a gray April morning carrying nothing except the cassette tape, which he had listened to every night for the final 6 months of his sentence, on a small player a prison counselor had quietly allowed him to keep. Paul was already at the piano when Robert was shown into Studio 2. He was playing something slow and unresolved, a melody that kept reaching for a conclusion and pulling back from it. He didn't look up immediately. He finished the phrase, let the last note decay into the room, then looked up and said, You came, as though there had ever been any question. They spent 4 hours together that morning. Paul played. Robert listened. And periodically Paul would stop and ask, with complete seriousness, not as a celebrity seeking validation, but as a craftsman checking his work. What does this one do to you? Specifically, don't be kind about it. Robert was not kind about it. He was precise. He used words that music critics had never used, because music critics had never listened from inside a prison cell at 2 a.m, with nothing between them and the sound but a concrete wall and 20 years of survival. Paul wrote everything down in a small brown notebook. Robert Callahan died quietly in Liverpool in the spring of 2019. He was 61 years old. He had spent the 20 years after his release running music sessions at a community center near the docks, the same docks his father had worked, the same streets where he had grown up, believing that music was evidence of something. He ran those sessions for young men coming out of prison, men who arrived with the same hollow eyes and careful posture he had carried out of Wormwood Scrubs. He played them Beatles records. He told them what golden slumber sounds like at 2 a.m, when the wall between you and the world feels permanent. He told them it doesn't stay permanent. He told them because he knew. 12 people attended his funeral. It was small and honest, the way he had lived. That morning, a card arrived at the funeral home. Handwritten. No return address. 3 sentences. The woman who organized the service said she recognized the handwriting from somewhere, but couldn't place it until later, much later, when it finally came to her. It read, "You told me once that golden slumbers was the sound of surviving. You were right. I've been trying to finish it properly ever since. P." Somewhere in a Liverpool community center, pinned to a corkboard with a single thumbtack, there is a torn piece of notebook paper. The handwriting belongs to a Beatle. The meaning of it belongs to a man the world never knew. And the song, you have known it your entire life. If this story stayed with you tonight, share it with someone who needs it. Subscribe so we never stop finding the ones the world forgot to tell.